Oglądam sobie mojego ukochanego człowieka. Crimson Desert, People Broke Brains, let's freaking go. Dajcie suba, lajka, wpadajcie na socjale, jazda.
Crimson Desert kind of reveals loads of it. Now I'm going to start us off with a quote, and here it is. You don't want to let people down at launch by making them anticipate something to such a high level, like it is the second coming. Now, Crimson Desert was kind of the second coming to many, and that quote was from that game's head of public relations when he was speaking to IGN just a few weeks before the launch. Do you know what? He was right to be worried. When a dev warns you not to treat their game like the second coming, it's a pretty good indicator that the hype may have just went too far. Not that investors really paid any heed to that. And we'll get to it soon because they've looked very silly. But what we saw was insane levels of scale, millions upon millions of views, and players ready for the big new thing. Then the game launched, the bubble burst, and reality happened. This is a game many of us wanted to succeed, and part of that is the story, because seemingly it is one of a studio that decided on
A nie
the
macie wrażenia, że to bardzo często tak jest w przypadku studiów growych, że bańki oczekiwań najróżniejszych rzeczy wokół gry są ogromne, później wychodzi gra i zawsze ten bubble pęka. Zawsze jest tak, że nieważne jaką spółkę gamingową sobie weźmiecie z polskiego rynku, chociażby CD Projekt jest tego bardzo dobrym przykładem, każde studio zawsze zachowuje się tak samo. Budujemy hype, a kurs akcji nam rośnie. Jest premiera, najczęściej to jest pik, albo jeszcze konsolidacja na tych bardzo wysokich poziomach. Później jest sprzedaż faktów i zjazd w dół. Bardzo często, rzadko widuje się, że jest takie właśnie konsolidacja i później jest jeszcze wyjazd w górę, bo bardzo często ludzie nadają tak nierealne, w sensie chcą tak nierealnych rzeczy, że ich nie da się dowieść i nawet GTA nie dowiezie, GTA 6 nie dowiezie tych wszystkich rzeczy, więc uważam, że GTA 5 będzie największą klapą nie dlatego, że będzie po prostu słabą grą, tylko GTA 6 będzie niewypałem ze względu na to, że oczekiwania, które narosły wokół tej gry są tak ogromne, że kurwa nikt ich nie spełni, naprawdę nikt.
right path. Pearl Abyss, the developers behind Black Desert Online, were actively walking away from their history of big multiplayer games to go and do a gameplay-driven, fantastic-looking action game instead. So obviously people were interested, but then they saw it and it was stunning, which, to be honest, if you'd played the likes of Black Desert, shouldn't really be too surprising. They can do visuals. The initial trailers racked up millions of views, and then the feature previews basically started to blow people's mind. The number of mechanics is honestly unhinged. We've got combo-driven combat, loads of minigames, town management, vehicles, Zelda-style physics puzzles, and a hell of a lot more.
Myślę, że w dzisiejszych czasach, no tylko, że właśnie to jest miecz obusieczny, że w dzisiejszych czasach, żeby to miało sens, gra powinna mieć bardzo to wyważone, że żeby kusić gameplayem i ilością mechanik i jakością gameplayu, ale nie kusić aż tak, żeby budować wokół siebie hype, bo bardzo często, tak mi się wydaje, że gry, które nie zbudowałyby wokół siebie dużego hype'u, miałyby znacznie większą tą końcową, dobrą odpowiedź community, nie? Ja zawsze wychodzę, trochę to jest takie podejście do życia w stylu, że zakładamy najgorsze, jak się wydarzy lepsze, no to cieszymy się, że stało się to lepsze. Tylko pytanie, czy można robić tak gry? Wydaje mi się, że właśnie tu jest problem, że nie można, bo wtedy na premierę kupi ci za mało osób tę grę. Jeżeli nie dasz tego hype'u, nie zbudujesz go, to ludzie nie będą chcieli kupić tej gry, nie będą jej chcieli odpalić, a przede wszystkim w ogóle mogą jej mogą ją po prostu przeoczyć, nie?
To the point where you do just say, how the hell can any of this be real? And there's clearly demand for a big world with depth. Think about all the pent-up hype for the next big Witcher game. Hell, we even know that Sony wanted to lock this game down as a potential console exclusive. And if it wasn't for Sony having a few foibles, that would almost feel like a Nintendo official seal of approval, like back in the day. Then we even got the promise of no microtransactions. It all kinda looked perfect, and in the wake of Stellar Blade, this was the moment for Korean developers like Pearl Abyss. They were ready to show the world that they could make single-player games that stand shoulder to shoulder with the best. And it wasn't just the people who were excited. No, it was the investors. They may just have priced in the expectation of this being the second coming. Just take a look at Pearl Abyss's stock price since Gamescom of last year. It hit a 2-year high whenever the game went gold in January, so expectations were always high. So high that of course the obvious was going to happen.
Jeszcze raz, aż sobie muszę to znaleźć. Perla Abyss Corp. Perla Abyss Corp. Notowania. Zobaczmy sobie, co to jest w ogóle. Czekajcie. To jest to. Czekajcie. Koreańskie to jest, nie? Tak? Dobrze mówię? Wartość w KRW. Ej, dobra. Wiecie, co to jest za waluta? Ja nie wiem, ale się zaraz dowiem. O kurwa. Dobra, dajmy sobie. A z ciekawości zobaczmy, ile to na polskie. Co? Nie, to chyba niemożliwe. 57 400. No, takie 140 zł. Ok. Zobaczmy sobie, jak to. No, klasyczne, mówię, to, co się zawsze dzieje na spółkach, tak? Przychodzi i później w pewnym momencie przed premierą albo chwilę po premierze realizacja zysków. I no, czasami naprawdę tego się nie da dowieść czasami. No, ale tutaj jeszcze dużo jest możliwości. No, ale wiadomo, pandemia, będzie trudno. Ale dobra, jazda dalej. Nierealne oczekiwania. Tyle powiem. Nierealne oczekiwania. To się nie dowiedzie.
And it wouldn't be modern gaming if people weren't pitted against each other. So, pre-launch and reviews were a little bit of a complex story. Big outlets like IGN, Eurogamer, and quite a few more panned the game. And even the most positive recognized issues of the likes of the control scheme, the chaotic deluge of stuff, because the game was just that packed, and a story that was deeply divisive. And what emerged from all this was a vibe, even from the positive reviews, that this game needed more than 8 hours to play before it really clicked. That is a lot to ask. This all led to a number being a little bit low than some people thought. Those people being the investors, because they began to sell off Pearl Abyss stock in droves, crashing the stock price by more than 30%. And the rationale here was absolutely wild. So, according to
Nie no,
Seoul
uzasadnienie
Economic
jest
Daily,
bardzo proste. Ej, ja nie rozumiem, o co chodzi. Uzasadnienie w przypadku gier i w przypadku tego, dlaczego ludzie to sprzedają, jest dość proste. Na premierę dużych gier, jakichkolwiek, Wiedźmina, Cyberpunka, bo no wiadomo, CD Projekt mamy tutaj, teraz był, akurat w przypadku CI Games to tak średnio, ale zawsze jest tak, że w momencie, kiedy ma wychodzić jakaś gra, no to hype się pod nią buduje i akcje rosną, bo są oczekiwania, później jest realizacja, czyli wychodzi gra, mija pierwsze tam kilka dni, no i później jest sprzedaż faktów, czyli po prostu sprzedawanie tego w dobrej cenie i to jest tak naprawdę w każdej grze zawsze tak to wyglądało, nigdy to nie wyglądało inaczej, więc ten schemat, jeżeli się śledzi, to poletko growe jest dość proste, tak uważam i naprawdę tu nie ma nic skomplikowanego. No, na palcach jednej ręki policzyć spółki, które rosły do premiery, po premierze się skonsolidowały klasycznie na jakiś czas i później znowu wystrzeliły do góry. No taka prawda.
Expected a high 80s aggregated score. They didn't see that, so they basically abandoned the game and the company. Now the thing here is, it's not like it was panned. The majority reviews were...
Wiedźmin miał tak, że po Wiedźminie akcje CD Projektu spadały, po Cyberpunku spadały. Im więcej nabuduje się przed premierą właśnie tego hype'u, napompuje się ten balonik, tym jego pęknięcie jest bardziej efektywne. W skrócie, pierdolnięcie i spadek później akcji jest znacznie większy. Im więcej się nabuduje, no po prostu u ludzi w głowie, nie wiem, powiedzmy oczekiwań, tak?
Actually fine. Like as a whole package, it landed at a high 7 or a low 8.
Więc tak naprawdę najlepiej by było, teraz ktoś powie, no to co, najlepiej w takim razie, żeby gra nie miała w ogóle hype'u, tak? No właśnie nie, bo jeżeli gra nie będzie miała w ogóle hype'u, to się nie sprzeda, tak? Więc to jest bardzo taki miecz obusieczny, że z jednej strony ten hype daje nam sprzedaż, ale bardzo często ten hype jest no jest ponad wszystko, nie?
8 out of 10. That's what's on the aggregation sites like OpenCritic. That's not a bad game. We're in this weird world where people think that 7 out of 10 is somehow awful and mid and slop. No, if you see a 7 out of 10, that may just mean it doesn't have extremely broad appeal. And that maps onto games. And what it means is that if we
No, to
want
też
to
jest
actually support
patologia,
the
ale to
types
już
of
jest
games that
patologia
we
na zupełnie inny odcinek, że w dzisiejszych czasach rzeczy, o których się mówi 7 na 10, to jest tak jakby to było coś strasznego, a jeżeli coś jest 10 na 10, to jest dopiero warte spojrzenia, a tak właśnie nie powinno być. No ale cóż, no to jest jakaś kurwa inflacja po prostu skali ocen i może po prostu oceny powinno się robić od 1 do 10 i tyle, ale no nie wiem.
like, we need to be willing to try out 7 out of 10s that may just happen to appeal to us more than to other people. So, it's a weird game, and most of the people who thought Crimson Desert was a game where you, quote, consume content, didn't actually review the thing. But we've seen this kind of thing before. That means we know what happens next. And one day after launch, they'd actually sold 2 million copies, but that's what they sold. It's not necessarily sentiment. And as it turns out, the reviews weren't wrong. There was not some huge gulf between game reviewers working for websites and YouTubers and people on Steam. No, what we saw is early Steam reviews landing at 60% positivity. PC players were often furious about the game's performance. There was also
Ej, dobra,
performance issues.
to jest rzadkie, że recenzenci mówią tak o grze i później ta gra faktycznie jest taka, jak mówią o niej recenzenci.
Console.
Plus
The
dla
control scheme
recenzentów
seemed
tutaj w tym
absolutely
wypadku, nie?
mad to many, and many decisions about gameplay left people confused. As it turns out, almost every reviewer's critique was echoed by players. And all of that was before the whole Gen AI art thing that, well, basically resulted in some assets slipping through the cracks. So by now, I think we can see how all of the hype and the drama and everything behind this, be it from players, reviewers, or of course the investor bunch, kinda says more about hype cycles and modern social media and that sort of thing than it does about the game itself. The game is just what it is. Maybe a 7.5 out of 10, but absolutely one that you may love. But what's
Ale chyba tam było, że właśnie oni sprzedali 5 milionów kopii już, więc to jest naprawdę niezły wynik. Wydaje mi się, że jeszcze nie pokryli w 100% jakby tego nakładu, który był, ale 5 milionów kopii to jest dobry wskaźnik. Czekajcie, zaraz zobaczymy. O Jezu. Zaraz zobaczymy, ile kopii sprzedali. Crimson Desert, ile kopii było? 4 miliony. No to nice. No to ładnie. 4 miliony.
We're in a
no to
strange world.
troszeczkę się pomyliłem.
clear is it isn't the second coming. It was never going to be the second coming. Its PR team literally told us it
Chyba
wouldn't
5
be that.
milionów, przepraszam, mi się pomyliło, bo gdzieś słyszałem takie coś, że 5 milionów, to jak będzie 5 milionów, to ta gierka się w miarę spłaci już. W sensie wyjdzie na zero, nie?
Weeks coming up to launch, and now we can actually understand why, because we know how this game was actually made. Pearl Abyss have only made one game before, and that is 2014's MMO Black Desert Online. I played a little bit of it myself. It's an odd game. It's known for having an incredibly impressive character creator, and over its lifetime, it's got 55 million players. Now, when Crimson Desert was first announced in 2019, it was a prequel to Black Desert Online. And it wasn't some single-player prequel to flesh out the world. No, it was an MMO. That's what they set out to make. It was them doing what they knew how to do. But then things changed. An interview with IGN revealed that during the 6.5-year development period of this game, a lot of things happened. The team changed engines, they built an entire
Im dłuższy okres czasu, tym więcej podczas tego okresu czasu może się wydarzyć niespodziewanych rzeczy. Kto by się kurwa spodziewał?
new one, and they overhauled the entire game from an MMO into a single-player experience. Of course, much of that MMO DNA seems to have survived into the final game, with a lot of players calling out the quest design and the controls as being MMO holdovers. Of course, that is the type of game that this development studio knows how to make. But there's another wrinkle to this story. Crimson Desert was supposed to launch 3 years ago. Yes, in 2023. Pearl Abyss had actually follow-up games. Plan 8, a Pokemon-like game called Dokev, seemingly meant to launch with Crimson Desert. So we can certainly deduce that development wasn't really easy. Here's where it gets more interesting. In an interview on the Friends Per Second podcast, the voice actor for the lead character, Cliff, described a 5-year recording process. That's certainly a contrast to Charlie Cox's 5-hour recording experience for Expedition 33. So, this guy spent a year and...
No, 5-letni, nie no, przez 5 lat nagrywać głos to jest kurde trochę, nie? No i tutaj też może to wskazywać ewidentnie na to, że to tworzenie tej gry nie było czymś prostym i miłym i przyjemnym.
Recording before finding out that the recordings he was doing was actually just demo work. And then they spent years before release trying to work with the developers to just lock down the story and the characters. And by his account, the main story of the game, as a sort of shattered tribe rebuilding themselves, only came into focus after 2.5 years of development. There was simply so much upheaval that Pearl Abyss couldn't lock down what they actually wanted from the story. Which makes sense. You've got changing genre, you've got going from multiplayer MMO to single player, even changing engine. So of course, that kind of thing would have taken a while. And even after launch, Pearl Abyss's CEO suggested that they'd done what they could with the time they had left for the story, but that he sympathizes with disappointment from players. Now, everything I've talked about so far is verified, right? But what's interesting is it lends credence to things that we cannot yet verify, which is because they come from unverified accounts on Blind. You may not have heard about Blind, but it's an industry-exclusive forum that lets verified game developers vent about their problems. Obviously, then, there is a bit of a sampling bias here. The people who come to this forum will have, self-selected themselves towards that forum. It's not like you're going to have as many of the happier stories of development. But what we do have is 2 unnamed developers describing Crimson Desert's development as chaotic. They had consistently changing leadership, magpie-like tendencies for grabbing features from other games, one of those apparently being the Tears of the Kingdom floating islands, and an inability to agree on a direction for the game, which resulted in the big chaotic hodgepodge that people ended up getting. Even just going by what we know to be true, the 6+ years of development, the focus and hyper-fidelity, and just the chaos of a game that took over 6 years to come together, yeah, Crimson Desert could never be the future of gaming that some people, and maybe a few investors, had built it up to be. But there's a reason why we're doing this video after the fact, because launch was not the end of the story for this game. Because even as it's not an MMO, players are still playing it like one, and Pearl Abyss are actually updating it like it is a live game.
No, w sensie
So during
generalnie
launch
to
week, Crimson
studio
Desert was the 6th most
naprawdę,
played game on
tam jest
Steam,
update
and it
po
was in the
update'cie,
top
update
30
po
over
update'cie,
on the
więc no,
consoles,
tam jest
which is
grubo, nie?
entirely respectable
Bardzo dobrze.
for a new game like this. Sales have now topped 4 million, which is
4
quite
miliony,
good,
tak jak
but
mówiłem.
most
W sensie
importantly,
myślałem, że
Pearl
5.
Abyss
Ale okej.
have been working hard, actually. They've been patching
No,
the game
tam
every
wychodzi
few
łatka
days.
za łatką,
4
łatka
days
za
after
łatką,
launch,
nie?
they had
Więc
fixed the
naprawdę
control
jest
bindings and
dużo
storage
tego.
problems. 3 days after that, they'd improved onboarding for their mechanics, they'd solved a bunch of graphical issues, and 3 days after that, they'd actually added in quality of life features to pare down the worst of the MMO grind tendencies that slipped in to the final game. That's quite something. And what it means is that the game reviewers who played and criticized this game before launch, they were
No,
basically
wydaje mi się, że to jest coś dobrego, że ludzie to krytykowali, dawali temu 7/10, a autorzy i deweloperzy zrobili coś najlepszego, czyli przyjmowali tą krytykę i robili wszystko, żeby to zmienić.
playing the game that players got in day
Zmieniają,
one.
bo to
And of
widać.
course, patches like this can fix controls, they can fix performance, but they can't fix some things, like the story being divisive, or just the design philosophy of the kitchen sink, throwing everything in there they could. Structural stuff, it's not bugs. But for the people who stuck around, that kind of thing was never the problem, because it turns out they wanted a massive sandbox, the endless progression, and a game you could buy once and play for months upon months upon months. And what we now see is that even in an era of supposed open world fatigue, there is actually an appetite for this kind of game. That's because all the while user sentiment has been growing. The people who bounced off the game bounced off the game. Abe even refunded it. And now we see that the audience who have stayed with it, number one has actually grown, and number two seems to be enamored. The user reviews in Steam are now at 85% positive, and the vast majority of those are coming from people who have invested 20 hours or more. And that does expose a
Bo
phenomenon
też słyszałem, że ta gra im dłużej się w nią gra, to po prostu staje się lepsza. I to jest
we
chyba
see in
dobre.
Steam. Steam score changes are almost more about a game finding its audience. And once a game has found its audience, the Steam score will look really good. And that's hardly surprising, because Steam scores are a simple positive negative, a little bit more similar to a Rotten Tomatoes score. And it's that leads me to what I think is the real point of this video. All the noise, all the anger, all the people fighting other people, I think was ultimately immaterial and a complete goddamn waste of time. Because as it turns out, Crimson Desert is a good game. It's not a great game.
Dokładnie
It's
tak.
not made for everyone. It's not a paradigm shift, the type that, say,
Na pewno nie jest to gra roku, tak?
some of the hype demanded, but it's a solid open world sandbox that does give a whole bunch of people exactly what they want. A dynamic sandbox, the type of thing that gives people tools and toys instead of big checklists, allowing them to make
Gra jest na pewno dobra, gra nie będzie Game of the Year, ale warto
their own
zagrać,
busted
jeżeli
builds
ktoś
and
to
have
lubi,
their
bo
own
się
fun.
naprawdę
That actually
odnajdzie
does
i
work.
uważam,
But
że
the real
że po
story
prostu jest
is the
dobra.
hype
Z
cycle
tego, co ja
itself. The
słyszałem.
game gets stunning trailers, millions of views, and by launch the discourse is so loaded with
Warto
noise
zagrać.
that
That's
the
it.
actual
Tak mi się
product
wydaje.
barely gets a fair shake. The disappointment gets completely amplified. The recovery gets ignored because what was it doing? It was feeding a hype cycle that works really well per the metrics, per the algorithms of social media sites, which funnily enough are optimized for engagement. They are not optimized for truth. Very often, only by waiting and trying to have a measured view of the situation do we actually get an approximation of reality. So, it's a good game with 4 million sales and a player base that genuinely loves
No,
it.
grono graczy na pewno będzie się powiększać, a wy możecie się powiększyć, dać suba, lajka, wpaść na kanał. Dzięki bardzo za oglądanie i do zobaczenia. Trzymaj się, cześć!